Okay, so first, what do I mean by explainable Bayesian learning? So this is a picture of the Bayesian workflow from Gelman and Guattari's new book. So when I say explainable Bayesian learning, I'm imagining that you've kind of already gone through this whole workflow. You've checked your prior, checked your computational tools, you checked your model, you provisionally accepted your model, and maybe you're looking at some ensemble of a model or something. So you're at the very end of this workflow. And at the end of this workflow, what do you get out? Typically you get out tens of thousands of samples of some parameters or some predictive quantities of interest. Okay, so we're at the end of this, and the question we want to ask is, how do we summarize, visualize, communicate all these different samples that we have? And in particular, I'm going to focus on cases when these parameters or these quantities of interest belong to some high-dimensional, non-standard space. And typically, I'll be looking at examples where we're working on discrete spaces, so we might have binary vectors, we might have partitions, or things like that. Okay, so now, past decades, we've seen lots of advances in data technology, both in volume and type, and that's led to a lot of interesting developments in methods and computational tools. And in many cases, this leads to posterior predictive distributions that are defined over these complicated high-dimensional spaces that are difficult to interpret. And there's been a lot of very nice work on developing models suited to this types of data, developing efficient inference algorithms, but often we lack tools for that final step of the workflow. So to explain and visualize the posterior and the predictive distributions. And if we're working in a Bayesian approach, one of the motivations that we often use is the additional uncertainty that we get out with the Bayesian methods. So when we're looking at tools to explain and visualize the posterior or these distributions, we would like to have some tools that not only just give us a point estimate at the end, but give us some idea of the uncertainty as well. And this is very important, often overlooked, but it's a very important step to showcase the benefits beyond. Okay, so before I go into the methods that we're proposing, I just want to talk about some different examples that we're looking at. I'm going to focus mostly on clustering, but I just want to give you a flavor, an idea of other problems that we're looking at. So the first example is variable selection. So we're looking at this with Jim. So in variable selection, we get out these samples of binary vectors. So we get this posterior distribution over possible subsets of variables that express our uncertainty about which variables are strongly linked to a response. So for example, maybe we're looking for genetic markers of a disease. And this is a picture taken from Jim's paper here of a GWAS study. We have around 42,000 variables. So this posterior is defined over a space of dimension 2 to the power of p. So it's very big in this setting. Okay, so we have this distribution over this huge discrete space. How can we summarize this distribution? So one thing you can do are looking at these PIPs, these marginal inclusion probabilities, and this just looks at each variable individually and says what's the probability that you're included in the model. But this can be misleading in some cases. So if you have groups of very highly correlated variables, you might have overall very low PIP values if you look at each one of these. Another thing you could do is try to build credible sets. So this is taking the models of these binary vectors, the highest posterior probability, but that's also quite challenging because you need to estimate the probabilities for each of these. And this is defined over this very high dimensional space. And another issue with this is that if you're just sorting them by the probability, so these are the top map models that maximize the posterior, they're often very, very similar. As you can imagine, if you just change just a single variable from being included or excluded, you're going to make very negligible changes to the posterior. Okay, another example, and this is the one I'm going to be focusing on in this talk, is clustering. So in clustering, we have a posterior distribution over the space of possible partitions to express our uncertainty about the existence of homogeneous groups of data points. So this is an example from one of my papers with Natalia and our PhD student, where we were using Bayesian clustering methods to identify cell types in single cell RNA sequencing data. Okay, so this is a huge space. The dimension of this space, if you allow for any possible number of clusters, it's a Bell number, it's very big. So how can we summarize this, all these different samples of partitions that we have? Okay, so the first question is just finding a good point estimate, one clustering solution that summarizes everything. And that was something that I looked at in earlier work. But the advantage of the Bayesian approach was to have that uncertainty. So how can we also describe some uncertainty around there? And we also developed this idea of constructing credible sets around this point estimate, but this also has some limitations because it relies on sufficient exploration of this very high dimensional space. Okay, and just to introduce one other example that I'll come back to later, this is still an example of clustering, but this is an application where we're trying to identify neural connectivity patterns. So we're interested in different questions. The two main ones are there groups of neurons with distinct projection patterns? And this helps to provide fundamental insight in how the brain organizes itself. And so we've looked at this in these preprints here. And in ongoing work, we're looking at how this wiring is altered in particular in autism. And so this hopefully will lead to insights on disorders and potentially unlock directions for novel treatments and therapies. So we've got a lot of interesting data here, and one of the advantages of the Bayesian approach is we have multiple types of data. We also have data collected across multiple brains. So the Bayesian approach gives us a natural way to integrate these multiple types of data. And just so you can see here, this is a type of data that's called single neuron reconstruction data. So all of these neurons, their body sits in the entorhinal cortex. So that the body is in the same region, and they place this dye into the brain, which allows them to track the axon and all the branching process of how the neuron connects to other parts of the brain. So here you can see these are neurons that all sit in the body is all in the same region, but there are different types of neurons based on their projection patterns. So we have some that are only connected to the front, some only connected to the back, and something in between as well. So this data is very high quality data, but it's very time consuming to collect this type of data. So we usually only have it for tens, at best 100 neurons. And so this is the new type of sequencing data that they have. So we can collect this now for thousands of neurons in a single brain. And what this is giving out is for each individual neuron, that's a row in this matrix, we don't have this intricate wiring pattern, but they've done the sequencing method to take biopsies in different regions, and we get counts out which reflect the strength of projection of an individual neuron to different regions. Okay, so all of this just boils down to a clustering problem where we want to try to cluster the neurons to understand if there are neurons that have different ways of communicating information in the brain. This is another example. So this is clustering under noise. It's a slight complication of the clustering problem because now not all of our points belong to our cluster. So some of them might just be background noise points. And so this is joint work with my postdoc, Lily, who has a background in signal processing. So this is a paper where we developed this MCMC, mostly her, developed this MCMC algorithm for this type of problem. And so here's an example data set that she's looked at. So we have these radar measurements. So essentially we observe these points. And this is a river in China, and if you see a cluster of points that are moving together, that suggests that there's a ship moving in the river, but you can also have just some noise points in the background as well. Okay, so in this case, what we get is a posterior distribution over these partitions that also include this potential noise artifact. So again, we want some ways to summarize this distribution. And just to say now, Lily's looking at an extension. So she's looking at, based on this approach of Bayesian level set methods that decouple the density estimation from the clustering based on this paper here. Okay, so I could go on and on about different examples and not get time to present the methods. So I just briefly say there are lots of other examples we can look at. And trees is one example that I've talked with one of my colleagues, Gregoire in Edinburgh. So this is an example from his paper where they're trying to trace the ancestry of sign languages. So what they get out from their model and their algorithm is a lot of samples of trees, and they want some way to summarize all of these different types of trees. And so this is one thing they do, which is this consensus tree that they build sequentially. So they show a split if it's present in most of the samples conditioned on the previous splits. Okay, and then there's some way limitations of doing it this way is that, you know, you could imagine this sequential construction might not correspond to the overall mode of the distribution. And you can also have some branches out here where there was no consensus of how to branch out. Okay, and I just wanted to give one more example of a predictive distribution. So if we're working in language models, we get predictive distributions over sequences that, for example, express our uncertainty on possible sentences. So in this case, capital T is the length of my sentence, and each YT is a token, say a word from a fixed vocabulary. K is typically very, very large. And so this distribution lives on a huge dimensional discrete space, K to the power of T. Okay, and there are lots of different models, for example, a recurrent neural network, a transformer, and so on, that give us this distribution over these sequences that live on these high dimensional discrete spaces. So how can we summarize this predictive distribution? These are the two most common things that people do. One is just this argmax prediction. So first sequentially choose the word that has the highest probability, so on and so on. So this is kind of trying to target the mode, but it's not necessarily the mode, of course, because you're building this sequentially. It would be computationally feasible to really target the node in this setting. The other is just in text generation, where you just sequentially sample from this distribution. And this is a nice paper that talks about some drawbacks of these two ways of summarizing this distribution, and references some other works that connect some issues with language models, like hallucinations are actually related to the way that we choose to summarize these distributions. So they look at a kind of Bayesian decision theoretic approach to summarize this distribution, which in this community they call minimal Bayes risk decoding. Okay, so these are all examples where we have these huge, these distributions over these huge dimensional spaces, and we want to find ways to summarize distributions. Okay, I just want to say briefly, how do we do inference in these very weird settings? I'm not going to say much, but I'll say there are lots of different ways we can do inference. Probably MCMC is the gold standard here. More recently, there's these predictive resampling and bootstrap techniques. So this is what Lily's been looking at in this clustering under noise example. And the advantage of this over MCMC is now we can do inference in parallel. Another thing we could do is look at variational approximations, but if we just look at mean field approaches, it often collapses around the mode. So instead, to really get better uncertainty out, we can take ensembles of variational approximations. And even just randomly initializing your variational approximation multiple times and just doing a cheap combination of those tends to work quite well in practice. But there's also been other work that do smarter ways of putting these variational approximations together. So you can do things like stacking, bagging, predictive resampling to have better ensembles of variational approximations. Okay, and we can use amortized variational inference. More recently, also neural posterior estimation. And so all of these techniques, except for maybe this one, maybe you have a closed form for the posterior, but it's this big ensemble. But most of these other ones just give you samples from the distribution. So in all these cases, we have this large number of samples over this high dimensional non-standard space. Okay, so finally we're going to get to, so how can we explain, summarize, visualize this distribution? Okay, so I said we're going to focus just on the context of clustering. So in the context of clustering, we do have some structure to this space. It forms a lattice. We do have a relation that gives us a partial ordering, but it's not a nice Euclidean space. So we can't just do things like take a posterior mean, look at the standard deviation. It's just not helpful in this setting. And another interesting question to think about is we know, for example, if we were just on the real line, and this was what our posterior distribution looked like, this red line is our posterior mean, we would plot that and say, okay, this is a bad summary of this distribution. So what if we're working in this weird space and we do all this work to get a nice point estimate, but the distribution was actually bimodal, multimodal, and that point estimate actually isn't even representative of distribution. Okay, so let's first focus on the problem of point estimation. So we have all of these samples over this big space. How do we find, for example, just a single clustering variable selection binary vector that summarizes all of these different samples? Okay, so one thing you can do is just look at the mode, the map, or the mode of the predictive distribution. If you're, for example, in the language context. Often finding this is not straightforward, so we have to rely on estimations and probabilities, or we have to do some sequential way of estimating this. Another thing we could do is just report a single sample, which is sometimes done in language modeling. Of course, if there's a lot of variability, just reporting a single sample is not very representative of this distribution. So instead, we're going to focus on Bayesian decision theory framework. So we want to find the Bayes estimator that minimizes the posterior expected loss. So for example, in the clustering context, rho would represent a partition or a clustering solution. So now this raises the interesting question of what kind of loss should we pick here? So we could just pick the 0, 1 loss. That will take us back up to the map again. But we could use some more problem-specific losses and just comparing and understanding different losses. This is a very interesting problem, but I don't have time to talk about that much here. But in this work, I'm going to focus on the variation of information for clustering. This was proposed by Mela in 2007, and this is, we showed why this is a good metric in this context in this paper. And so with Jim now and some collaborators in Edinburgh for the variable selection problem, we're looking at the generalized Hamming distance. For the clustering under noise example, Lily's looking, she's defined this extension of the variation of information for this noisy setting. And there's also been utility functions, which is just the converse of the loss, do 1 minus it, in the case of sequences. So this is just one example, but there are various other utility functions that have been used in language modeling. Okay, so essentially what we're doing in this work is just to enhance the toolkit. So instead of just giving you a single estimate to summarize that posterior, we just want to give multiple point estimates. So we like the Bayesian approach because it provides uncertainty. This is not captured by just giving one single point estimate out. And we know that that single point estimate could be misleading if the distribution is multimodal. So we just want to report a small number of multiple point estimates that characterize the main patterns in the distribution. So one nice thing about this is if we already have tools to describe and visualize a single point estimate, if we have now a small number of multiple ones, we can just use those same tools for each of those. We have looked at developing problem-specific tools to help characterize the differences between the different point estimates. And of course, we do acknowledge that this gives a limited explanation of the uncertainty, but it still is a useful and a simple and useful tool to explain the posterior beyond just reporting one single point estimate. Okay, so how do we get out these multiple point estimates? And so the idea is quite simple. Let's just approximate our posterior with Q, which only has positive mass on a small number L of particles. So each particle will be one of our point estimates. And we're going to find this Q by minimizing the Wasserstein distance based on a problem-specific loss. Okay, so we want to find the weights and the particles of Q by minimizing the Wasserstein distance. And this is just the definition of the Wasserstein distance. So J is a coupling. So if rho is a clustering solution, this is a distribution over the product of partition spaces with marginals P and Q. Okay, and we can also give an interpretation to the Wasserstein distance in this case as measuring the minimal amount of uncertainty lost when you summarize with these L particles. Okay, yeah, and so this is just in the case of clustering, where I'll show you the examples later. These rows are partitions, and I'm going to be using that VI loss here. Oops, did I skip? No. Okay. So I think one question I always get asked is why not use the KL? Why do we need to use the Wasserstein distance here? So everybody's familiar with the KL variational inference, and it's used a lot in statistics and computer science. So the issue with the KL here is that it's mode seeking. And so Ciccilia looked at this in some previous work, and it's not too difficult to show that in this case, your top particles would just correspond to the top map estimates, the partitions with the highest posterior. And the weights would just be proportional to the posterior of this. So the issue with this is this only captures very minimal variations around the node. So if we take a clustering solution, the mode of that, and we would just change the allocation of a single data point, the posterior mass is not going to change much. So these top partitions tend to consist of a bunch of clustering solutions that only change the allocation of a single data point. So they're not really characterizing the variability in the distribution. Okay, so we came up with a cute name, Wasabi, for the approach. So one nice thing about it is if we take L equal to 1, our optimal particle just takes us back to the phase estimator, so the single point estimate we would have reported under our chosen loss. And this is quite easy to see because the Wasserstein distance just reduces to the posterior expected loss in this setting. Okay, so in the context of clustering, I'm going to call the min VI. This is the Bayes estimator under the VI loss, or our Wasabi approximation if we just take one particle. And here, the expected loss, we'll think of it as measuring the spread around that point estimate. Okay, so what happens when L is bigger than 1? So when L is bigger than 1, I'm not going to go into the details, but it's not too difficult to show that if the particles are fixed and I minimize over the coupling and the weights jointly, the optimal thing to do is for each partition, give all of its posterior mass to the particle that it's closest to. Okay, so now that's the optimal form of the weights and the coupling. So all we need to do is minimize over the particles now. So we want to find the particles that minimize the posterior expected VI within each, what we call Voronoi cell. And so the Voronoi cell, we call this because it's been shown back starting from the 80s, this nice connection between the Wasserstein distance and the k-means algorithm. So if we're just in Euclidean spaces and using Euclidean distance here, we have this nice connection between the Wasserstein distance. So the k-means algorithm gives us a local solution to this problem if we're just back in Euclidean space. So now we can just use a k-means like algorithm just on this more complicated space to find a local solution to this problem.
Sorry, can I just get clarification? So rho itself I mean, the distribution you're approximating with Q star is still over a finite number of partitions, just a lot of them, or
Yes.
okay. Are you going to talk at some point about the cost of doing this? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
I'll show the algorithm later. Okay, well, one thing related to that is that in practice, we don't have access to the full posterior. What we have are all of our samples from whatever algorithm we want to run. So say we have kind of 10,000 different samples. Then we're just going to try to find these particles that now minimize this approximate expected loss based on our samples. Our Voronoi cells now only are partitioning the space of our samples. Okay, so in the end, what do we get out? We get out multiple point estimates. We get these multiple point estimates out, and again, we can use domain-specific tools to visualize each of these individually. We also get the weights out. So the weights tell us how representative each particle is of the posterior. We get the expected loss within each Voronoi cell. So that tells us how much uncertainty is there locally for each particle. And then we can just combine these two things to get out the Wasserstein distance, which tells us how much information is lost with this summary. Okay, so now I'll give you an example before I talk about the algorithm, just to illustrate this. So this is quite a simple, maybe when you first look at it, maybe it looks a bit boring. It's just data generated from R, and it's just generated from this mixture of two normals. And why is this interesting? It's interesting because, well, you'll see in a minute why, but you can see if you look at the data, this red line is the true data generated distribution. So you can just barely see the two modes from the red line. But if I took away that red line and just showed the histogram of the data, it would be quite hard to see, is there one group, is there two groups? So we're going to take this data and we'll fit a model called the Dirichlet process mixture model, and we'll just use some standard packages that run MCMC that give us lots of different samples of clustering solutions from this model. And this is interesting because there was this paper from 2014 by Jeff Miller, who showed that this model is inconsistent for estimating the number of clusters. And so what he really said is marginally, if you look at the number of clusters, it's overestimated. And if there's just one, he had an example where there was just one, and the probability of having just one cluster marginally goes to 0 as n goes to infinity. But seemingly a bit paradoxically or controversially, there was this subsequent paper where he said, well, let's not just focus on the marginal of k, let's look at the map partition, the one with the highest mass. And this one instead is consistent. So despite that behavior marginally of k, the mode is correct. But he does show that while here we get overestimation if we look marginally at k, instead the map tends to underestimate the number of clusters. So for example, in this setting where we have two that aren't well separated, it'll just say there's only one. Okay, so here I just looked at this example empirically, fit the model, same samples, and I'm just looking at different ways in that final step to summarize those samples. So if I was just to look marginally at k, I get this story. If I look at the map partition, I get one cluster. If I use a different loss function, the BI, I get one cluster. And this was another loss function that was widely used before our 2018 paper. This one gives us 59 clusters. So how you summarize this distribution is very important. Another interesting thing about this example is that the posterior shows evidence of multimodality. So each dot here is a partition, and this is the map partition up here, just one cluster, everyone together. There were 600 data points. And this x-axis is showing the distance to that map partition, and this is the posterior relative to the map. So this numbers here, these are all partitions with just 2 clusters, and this shows the sizes of the 2 clusters. So when we split off a single data point, the posterior doesn't change too much, or move a little bit further from the map. As we continue splitting off more, we start to decrease, but then at some point, the posterior starts to increase again, and we get 2 clusters more equal size. Okay, so we have this multimodality, and this is another example that shows you the limitations of using the KL, because here there are actually 600 partitions up here that could split off a single point in its own cluster. So if I was to take 601, I would likely get those as my credible set for this example. And it's not characterizing that variation that we see all the way on the other end. So what we get instead when we use wasabi in this example, so here we picked just 2 particles. The one with the highest weight, it's slightly above 0.5, it's just that one cluster solution, but with a little bit less than 0.5, we have another clustering solution that has 2 clusters that basically split the data based on whether they're positive or negative. Okay, here's the algorithm. So it's essentially very similar to a k-means like algorithm, but just on this more abstract space. So this step here is given the particles, determining the Voronoi cells. And in this step, given the Voronoi cells, we just need to find the optimal particle. Okay, and so computing this BI loss, this is comparing 2 different partitions. Computing this is of order n, the number of data points. And we have to do this for all of my partitions and all of my particles. That scales like O and TL. And this, we have some nice algorithms now that we can make use of to search for the optimal particle there. So this cost depends on which algorithm you choose there. But overall, the step will scale like n times t times L. And we can also make use of things in k-means like mini batch options to speed up some of these steps as well. And some initialization tricks as well that are used in k-means. We just abstract them to this more complicated space to help improve the convergence as well. How do we choose the number of particles? Here, we're just doing something very simple, but you could do something more clever here. We're just looking at basically an elbow method, because what we want to do really is, if our goal is to summarize and explain, choose the fewest number of particles as possible. So we would only increase L if it really helps to lower the Wasserstein distance. Okay, and this is just a little illustration of this, but hopefully it's clear to everybody. So imagine each of these dots is, say, a partition, and this is what the true posterior would look like over this space. We don't have access to this true posterior. What we have are some samples from that. And we're essentially running this kind of more abstract k-means like algorithm on this space. So we iterate between the steps of given the particles, Let's compute the Voronoi cells for each partition, find which particle it's closest to. And then given the Voronoi cell, we just need to run these algorithms to find the optimal point estimate. And this is just to highlight that these algorithms let me search also beyond the space of samples. Okay, so I'll show you how much time do I have? 5 minutes?
Yeah. 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Okay. So here's another synthetic example. We call this the flower example. We have our 4 flower petals. And this is the posterior similarity matrix here. So this is data points against data points. And then red here represents a very high probability of co-clustering between the 2 points. So you can see there's some kind of blocks of red here, but also a lot of yellow. There's a lot of uncertainty in how to group these points as well. Okay, so this is an interesting example because it shows where you can get a misleading point estimate out. So the single point estimate that minimizes the expected VI loss has this kind of funny shape, upside down L-shaped cluster. And so this one is splitting off this block. And you can see here, it's not certain whether we should group these together or group those together. So it just puts everything together in this L-shaped cluster. And instead, we use Wasabi to summarize this with not 1, but multiple particles. Here, maybe 3 seems to be good enough to approximate this. We can see that we no longer have that funny L-shaped clustering solution, and we see there's 2 possible solutions. So this one is always split off, but then it's uncertain whether to have one elongated one here or an elongated one here. So just to say, I used a Gaussian mixture model here where I could have different variances along the different axes. So that's why it's getting these kind of shaped clusters out. And then there's also this third particle, which just splits them out. So once we have these particles, we talk about different recommendations to visualize these particles. In the example of clustering, for each one, we can again use standard tools, just plot the points colored by cluster membership. For D bigger than 2, this is usually in some lower dimensional space. We can also plot the posterior similarity matrix for each particle within the cell. So that tells us how much uncertainty is there within the local neighborhood. We have the weight and the expected loss. Again, how representative is it? This quantifies how much uncertainty there is. And we've also developed some specific tools to help compare the particles. So I won't talk about this too much, but one nice property of this BI distance is you can write it as a sum over all the data points. So you get this term that tells you how much each data point is contributing to the distance between the 2. And we also look at the meat of the particles. So this is the greatest lower bound in the Hasse diagram. So essentially we just intersect all the clusters, and this tells us which data points are always together across the different particles. So here's just one of these visualizations. This is looking within each cell, how much uncertainty there is. There's not a lot of interesting difference in this example, but that third one that split them into 2 does show a slightly higher uncertainty compared to the first 2 particles. This is what the meat of the particles look like. So these are the groups that are always clustered together. And then we see some groups along the border that are uncertain about which cluster they should belong to. And we can also look at a posterior similarity matrix for the meat as well, which tells us what's the probability under our approximation Q that some of these meat clusters are merged together. Okay, and so when is this useful? We did a lot of synthetic experiments, and basically we find that this is useful if we have a well-specified model, but the components are not well separated, or if we have a misspecified model. I'm not going to show you the results for this one, but we looked at things like a skewed T, where we go from just a normal to something that's more skewed, and then we get more interesting uncertainty on what the clustering solution is in that case. Instead, I'll talk about this one. So this is just taking that for that example, the flower example, and seeing what happens when we push the petals together or we pull the petals apart. And so basically what happens is when we push them all together, it finds just one clustering. This is quantifying the improvement we get when summarizing with just one partition, or in this case, we summarized with 10. So we don't get too much improvement relatively. We just summarize with that one, with just one solution when everything's over close together. And then when they become further apart, this is where we get the greatest improvement in summarizing with multiple compared with just one. And then it starts to go down again when the clusters start to get more well separated because it's more confident of having that 4-cluster solution. Okay, and just to go back to the example with the neural projections. So this is just one of the data sets that we looked at. And the main thing that I'm trying to communicate with them is, they're used to having the data like this and just giving a single clustering solution and saying, these are the types of the neural projection types. And so what I'm trying to get them to see is that, these might not be the types that are there. There might be some uncertainty. So for example, here it split this one off into its own cluster. Maybe it should just be part of this larger noisy cluster. Here it split these ones into these 2 clusters. Maybe it should be shuffled around a bit more. And we have this group of neurons that are projecting to these 2 regions almost. Okay. So I think maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this. This was just about, we've looked at using this kind of beyond the Bayesian setting when we're uncertain in the data itself. So for example, when we're using high dimensional data, we typically standard pipelines just project the data down to a lower dimensional space first, and then do clustering on the space. But if we look at probabilistic approaches like PPCA or variational autoencoders, these give us a distribution over that latent space. So we could sample from that, have multiple clustering solutions, and use this to summarize that distribution as well. Another example that we're looking at is missing data. So typically we first apply computation like mean, and then we would do some clustering algorithm. So if we did multiple imputation to capture our uncertainty of this missing values, then we'd run the clustering algorithms for each of these, and this could capture the uncertainty due to this missing. Yes. Okay. So sorry, apologies for this skipping. Okay, I'm gonna go to the end. So yes, this is just a summary. One thing we also thought about was, instead of having the goal of summarizing the posterior or explaining the posterior, You could also use this to compress the posterior, so you don't have to save all of those samples. So if that was your goal, you might want to choose a larger L there, so you get good predictive estimates. So we're also looking at using this in other settings, like I mentioned. And an interesting question to ask, which I think would be very tricky to answer, is just, could we obtain this approximation directly without having to do the sampling first? And as I mentioned, we're looking at extensions beyond the Bayesian setting as well. So just wanted to thank everyone involved. Cecilia in particular has done most of the clustering work with me. Lily is my postdoc working in this clustering with noise. Andrew, along with Jim, is looking at this variable selection problem. And Gulshan is my main collaborator, the neurobiologist that's helping with this application. We've recently started a new Bayes AI section of ISBA. If anyone's interested, we're organizing the first meeting in October. And that's everything.
Right, we've got 5 minutes. Questions? Well, the fact it feels kind of foundational what you said about, okay, if you just took a Dirac measure at a single point and using that to approximate the posterior, you're going to arrive at the kind of point estimate. And so then it feels to me like what you're saying about, okay, well, what we're going to do instead is take a mixture of Diracs, a collection of points, and we want to find the points of the weights. It's quite a general idea. So do you think there is, you obviously focused on cluster analysis here, but have you thought a little bit maybe beyond, it feels like sort of ideas like this, similar to this kind of exist in terms of summarizing the data with smaller sets of data, maybe particle methods for approximating posterior. Have you thought a bit about how this fits in more generally and whether it could be useful in other spaces?
I mean, this is I think it could be useful in a lot of other settings, but it's kind of these examples, these are kind of extensions that we're thinking about now. But yeah, if you have any ideas,
and do you think like, because I guess one way of thinking about credible intervals feels like you could maybe set up a problem like this where, you know, like you're insisting that your posterior is concentrated, not your approximation is concentrated in a bounded region, and you minimize the Wasserstein distance or something like that. Do you think that one could set up credible interval type estimation problems in the same way? Because I'm trying to learn, you know, it's a continuous problem, but you know, you're trying to learn a sort of bounded region that's small that captures a lot of interesting features.
If you're working in like a planning space, or yeah. We haven't really thought about, we're mostly focusing on these kind of discrete problems where it is much more challenging to think about, but I think it could be useful. Just to planning spaces, just potentially to just thin the chain.
Yeah, sure. I don't know, but I'll just first.
I'll ask for on. I had a different question, but this next work. So is there a sense, what Dan was saying, is there a sense in which you're approximating, I mean, if you're approximating the posterior, maybe it's discrete masses for some weights, is this a type of variation of inference? I mean, you're disconnecting them, right? That it's like a cut model in that whatever you do afterwards doesn't affect what you were doing before. But is there a sense of thinking of it like that?
Yeah. I mean, it's just I guess here, I mean, this is the usual and usually in variational inference, you have to work with the KL diversions. So it is just like this. This would be the variational approximation, but just replacing this with the Wasserstein distance. and the loss that we've chosen.
But none of this doesn't go into your inference, right?
No.
Your MCMC samples are what they are.
Yes. And so that's the question is, you know, if we could just bypass the MCMC samples and get this directly.
I see, now I.
Honestly, I don't know if that is worth going into because we have so many good tools now to
Yeah.
sample from this. And, you know, if we're working in these weird spaces, trying to get something that would target this
Okay.
directly. But it could be, I think, if we wanted to try something, probably that variable selection would be the easiest place to start because that's just binary vectors.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about theoretical guarantees. Thought a bit about this, for example, like if you had a label, you had some idea of through labels and some sort of guarantees on whether somewhere from the collection of particles would be through partition.
So we haven't thought about that, but we have some work that's a very small step in the progress towards it. We haven't finished it yet, but let me go back here. So basically L equals 1, and we're not looking at the posterior, we're looking at the prior and trying to characterize, we can characterize explicitly in that setting what the optimal clustering solution looks like. And it's very interesting because you have you get these phase transitions where it's either the optimal thing is just everybody in one cluster or all singletons. And then the parameters of this prior essentially determine this phase transition. And then we did some result. We have nothing in the posterior yet. We did empirically studied this. This is what happened when we go on either side of this phase transition, and this behavior continues to persist in the posterior as well. So it's a very small step in that direction, but it is quite interesting.